Back with another one, Miss Jensen. 1.12, conforming continuity over an interval. Alright? So let's start with just finding the domain. Alright? Looking for a restriction in the domain. A restriction is when it creates an error. So when you can't have 0 in the denominator, and so x can't equal -1, because if it did, it would make a 0 in the denominator and create an error. And you cannot have a negative under the square root and create an imaginary number, which is not a real number. So it has to be greater than 7x plus 3. We shift it around. X has to be greater than -3/7. Now looking at this one, you can't have a negative natural log. So 2x plus 1 has to be greater than 0. When you flip the equation around, or flip the interval to have 0 isolate on one side, you get x. It has to be greater than -1/2. Now, looking here, these are all the same, but when we factor, which we really didn't have to factor, to find out that x cannot equal 0 because it would make a 0 in the denominator. Going here, we know that x cannot equal 0 because it would make a 0 in the denominator, but we also know that x has to be greater than -5 to make sure there is not a negative underneath the square root. We also know here that x has to be greater than 0 in order to not have a negative underneath the square root. But also, x cannot equal 4 because the square root of 4 is 2, and then 2 minus 2 is 0, and that would create a 0 in the denominator. So, when you would write it in this form, you know it can't equal 0, and then it would approach 4, cannot equal 4, 4 to infinity. And here, this one, we use a number line. So we got the natural log of x over x minus 4. So when x over x minus 4 is, when x is negative, it creates a negative. And negative times a negative is a positive. But in between 0 and 4, which is a positive value, it creates negative because 3 being negative, and that would create a negative. But when it's approached from the right positively, it's going to make a positive number in the denominator and the numerator, and that will make it positive overall.